What's going on? I'm Austin. Today, why not try making a shaker storage bench with hidden shoe storage? Most of the materials for this project are pretty straightforward and things you can pick up at Lowe's or Home Depot. But a twist this time is the upholstery. You'll need to make a trip to the fabric store or, like I did, to Amazon to pick up some high-density foam and fabric. But overall, it's mostly comprised of straight cuts, screws, and plenty of opportunities to hide your mistakes. I started by breaking down a sheet of 3/4 inch paint grade plywood. I'd recommend planning out your cuts before you go to the store. If you know that you can have Lowe's or Home Depot rip your sheet in half like I did, it'll make it easier to transport home. I started by ripping the sides, bottom, top, and shelf with my circular saw, and then moved them over to the table saw to trim to exact size. If you're a little more confident than I am with your circular saw, or maybe you have a track saw, there's no reason for this second step. I will say, if your garage is your shop like mine, invest in some ear protection. The sound bouncing off the garage door was pretty deafening at first. Next is on to assembling the body of your bench. For this, I decided to use pocket hole screws. First, I marked on each piece where I needed to drill, basically connecting the side panels to the bottom and then to each other. Be sure to mark which side's up. I got a little overconfident and drilled a few holes facing the top. You'll see how I filled those a little later. As for this project, I'm still using a basic pocket hole jig, but with so many holes, I'm really considering an upgrade. Laying down some glue, I set the first side in place and used some DIY corner braces to keep it at 45 degrees. I'll probably do a video on how to make these pretty soon. I continually checked for square as I clamped it down. When everything looked good, I drove in 4 pocket screws across the bottom and repeated this process on the other side. My end pieces also had holes to connect the front and back. I used a brad nailer to pin them in place, clamped the sides to keep things tight, and added screws. Because we're using 3/4 inch ply, this already made the bench fairly strong. To create the hidden shoe compartment and also ensure strength, I put a panel down the middle of the bench. I measured out just enough room for the shelf, we'll add later, and marked its position. The thought being when people sit in the middle of the bench, this would create added support. Again, a couple of brad nails to hold in place, and then pocket screws. Just for good measure, I put a few corner braces in, but honestly, I don't think these were needed. Finally, I used a piece of scrap 1/2 inch ply for the bottom of the right side compartment. This could just as easily be 3/4 inch, but I thought it might cut down the weight. Next, I added some edge banding to any exposed plywood end grain. Edge banding is basically a strip of wood veneer with a heat-activated glue on one side. I picked up a roll 50 foot long off Amazon for about 25 bucks. I cut pieces to rough length, and then with an iron, began to apply heat, keeping the iron moving slowly back and forth until I had good adhesion. Be sure to run your iron across the top and slightly on an angle on your edges. The banding is just wider than 3/4 inch, so you'll need to trim it later. I used snips to cut off the ends and then a razor blade to cut my corners at 45 degrees for a mitered effect. This whole process took about 45 minutes. Then, with some sandpaper, blended the edges. This will really hide any imperfections during trimming. Because you'd see the inside of the box when it's open, I filled the pocket holes with dowels, gluing them in and then trimming flush with a multi-tool before sanding smooth with an Orbital sander. Now it's time to build our shaker panels. I decided to go for a full coverage look, so the panels simply need to match the size of each side, leaving that 3/4 inch bottom exposed for a raised look. I next measured and cut each of my boards to length in pairs so they had an exact match, making my vertical boards, also known as stiles, the full height of my bench. After that, I cut the horizontal pieces, or rails, so that they would fill the rest of the space. Starting with a test piece, I set my table saw to cut the grooves. I marked the center of the board and then offset the blade just to the left, then raised it to about 1/4 inch. Then ran the piece through, flipped it, and cut the groove. After a test fit, I was good to go. A router table would probably make this more precise, but if you don't have one, this should do the trick. Hey, if you're enjoying this project, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. There's a lot more great projects on the way. After you make all your cuts, be sure to sand the groove to remove any scraps that may remain. This will ensure a tight fit. Now you're ready to assemble the panels. I've never had great success cutting tongue and groove on the table saw, so I simply skip the tongue. To fill the gap that creates, I just trim some 1/4 inch plywood pieces about 3 inches long and glue them in. Using the pocket hole jig, I drilled holes in all the horizontal rails and began assembling 2 of the sides. First gluing in the plywood piece to fill the end, then clamping it down on a flat surface, making sure you have a tight fit. Check for square and screw together. Then repeat on the other side, leaving one end open for your 1/4 inch panel. Next, with a dry fit, I placed the last rail in place and measured for the exact side of my panel insert, remembering each of our grooves is 1/4 inch deep. Then, setting my fence to the measurements I just took, cut the panels. This is always a moment of truth to see how square and exact your work is. In this case, everything went together great. Starting out, I used to glue in all my panels, but as my work got more precise, I was able to just leave them loose, and that's what I did here. Then gluing in another piece of ply to fill the end, I clamped and checked for square before adding the final screws. To keep all your joints smooth, be sure to sand the transitions even, along with any edges that might need it. One of our side panels will act as a door. Because you'll see the back side, I filled these pocket holes with dowels and sanded smooth. After a couple coats of paint, you'll hardly notice them. Speaking of paint, I went ahead and added a coat of primer, then 2 coats of white latex, then finally painted the interiors a dark blue. Next, it's time to upholster the top. Full disclosure here, this was my first time, but thankfully there's YouTube, right? I cut a piece of 1 inch high density foam to size and attached with spray adhesive. Then wrap that with batting you can pick up at really any fabric store. A heavy duty stapler is really needed here. Pull the batting Pull the batting over and staple around, doing your best to keep the corners nice and neat like you would when wrapping a gift. Then repeat the process with your fabric, or whatever you choose to cover it with. Because you'll be flipping the seat up and exposing the bottom, I got some scrap fabric I had laying around to cover it. I simply folded the edges under for a clean edge, added some spray adhesive and a few staples to pin in place, then used a hot glue gun to hold the rest of the edges tight. Then it was time to attach the panels. Using some clamps and cardboard to keep from scratching the piece, I lined each panel up and then drove in screws from the inside. To install the door, I first made a jig, marking the position of my door opening on a scrap piece of wood, then drilling 2 holes where the hinges would need to sit. I have to give a shout out to the WoodBrew channel. They have a great video on this exact technique. I then screwed the hinges into the jig. This allowed me to clamp the scrap board on to replicate the door's position, while I marked the exact screw positions, then drilled pilot holes. Then, all I had to do was remove the hinges and use the holes to guide my drill placement on the actual door. This worked like a charm. At this point, we're really in the home stretch. To attach the bench seat / lid, I used non-mortise hinges to keep it setting as flat as possible. I marked and drilled pilot holes, then attached the hinges to the upholstered seat first, then leaned it up against a table to hold it in position and attached it to the body. After that, I put on a pair of lid support hinges to hold up the top when it was in use, keep it from falling down. Finally, I installed a shelf in the hidden compartment. For this, I just shot in 4 machine screws and rested the shelf on top. And that was it. Alright, that's it for this build. I hope you enjoyed it. It came out really nice. I wish I could have done a little better on the upholstery, but for my first time, that was alright. This is why I love custom furniture. It's exactly what I was looking for. It matches the kitchen where it's going to be placed, and it has all the features that you wouldn't be able to find anywhere else. That's why you build it yourself. More projects are on the way, so subscribe if you haven't, like this video if you liked it, and until next time, thanks for watching.